1533. The evil companionships corrupt good morals. There's some debate about whether this actually comes from Euripides. It was just kind of a generally understood statement that probably did end up in some of the playwrights. Okay, very quickly, what is Aristotelian tragedy? Well, you'll remember from earlier comments. Some of you are smiling already, right? Okay, here we go. Let's talk about it. You have a protagonist who begins high and ends low. The fall of the protagonist, of course, is going to happen through his hamartia, that is to say his tragic flaw. Usually it's pride. This fall, of course, will elicit catharsis out of the audience in fear and pity, and the audience's experiences of fear and pity will lead, of course, to identification with the protagonist, which is what makes the protagonist the protagonist. The other thing we should point out, and this is in the last line of this information at the beginning that Milton writes, is you do all of this in the unities of time, place, action, and especially 24-hour period. The other thing that Milton says is that this is a play, but it's a play just to be read, not a play on the stage. Now, let's continue. Finally, before we begin our study of the actual play, the play poem itself, we want to understand Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes as finally autobiographic, right? Think about this. He publishes the poem in 1671. He dies in 1674. What that means is, when we are reading Samson Agonistes, we are reading the last words Milton wrote, the great poet Milton, writer Milton. The first thing I want to say, though, about this understanding how we're going to read this as autobiographic is to comment that if we said earlier that we read Paradise Regained as the understanding from tree to tree, the tree of forbidden knowledge to the tree that Christ is hung on the cross, we can understand this bit of story from temple to temple. I'd like to think for a moment just back to some lines that we studied together in Paradise Regained, Book 1. And I want to take a look at these lines again, lines 201 to 212. Listen to this. And as I read this, and this will be Jesus Christ, the Son of God, of course, in Milton's rendering in a soliloquy, remembering what it was like to be young. But here, I want to pay attention to the ways in which we'll read this as Milton thinking about young Milton. When I was yet a child, no childish play to me was pleasing. All my mind was set serious to learn and know, and thence to do. We pause for a moment and remember that Milton was educated in the same way that John Stuart Mill will be educated. Brilliant, prodigious, brilliant learning from a young age. And all he wanted to do is learn and know, and thence to do. What might be public good? Milton always was interested in the public good. Myself, I thought, born to that end, born to promote all truth, all righteous things, therefore above my years. The law of God I read and found it sweet, made it my whole delight, and in it grew to such perfection that ere yet my age had measured twice 6 years, when he was 12 years old. At our great feast I went into the temple there to hear the teachers of our law, and to propose what might improve my knowledge or their own, and was admired by all. Now, I think it's interesting and ironic that we end in Samson Agonistes, in, of course, the story, in a temple that, of course, Samson is going to pull down, a house of worship, we might say. Of course, Milton has always had this kind of interesting and ironic relationship with church and philosophy. How much should one give one's energies to the study of classical philosophy versus, of course, the reading of theology and Christian theology especially? Of course, speaking of philosophy, in the autobiographic reading of this final text of Milton's, we're going to have this discussion of theodicy and justice, the power of knowledge, the dangers of knowledge, and of course the power of suffering. I've already mentioned that notion of let this cup pass from me. Milton is very interested in the propedeutic, didactic, instructional power of suffering. Of course, we've said this before and we'll have to say it again. This is a text that's going to resurrect again Milton's conflicted views of women and the patriarchy and the idea, like Aristotle had taught, as we said in earlier lectures, that it is an organic view that men run the world and women need to get right with it. And if you've got a problem with that, then you've got a problem with the God who has set up that system. And that is an atheistic position. Of course, we know all about the different ways in the history of thought and politics that women have been subjugated by virtue of that idea. It's going to come back here. We're going to hear some nasty misogynist language that Milton will write, and I'll point it out. He had daughters. It's fascinating. Of course, he was, Milton, the failed politician, the failed revolutionary, and so there's a lot of, I think, self-doubt about that, and why did it fail, and maybe there wasn't enough of the English people listening to Milton at the time. Samson's going to make some comments similar. Finally, there's this sociological reading, the contest between fathers and sons. We began our comments by pointing out that Milton told his father in a famous poem Ad Patrem, I'm going my own way. His father was a scrivener. He was a writer, but he was more of a scrivener. And he wanted Milton to not do what Milton did, go his own way. Milton went his own way. Of course, we're going to have Manoah and his son Samson. We're going to think as well about, for example, Priam, the king of Troy, and his son Hector in the Iliad, at the end of the Iliad, and Priam coming to ask for his son's body. We're going to think of Odysseus and Telemachus in these ancient ways of thinking of fathers and sons. I've already, we mentioned other kind of classic understandings of Agamemnon and Orestes. I mean, this idea just goes on and on. Oedipus, of course, and Laius. The father and the son, of course, Christ. Think about Satan from Paradise Lost and sin and death, that kind of strange allegory of demonic fatherhood. And as we've said, of course, Milton and his father. All of this will, of course, stand behind our study. Now, let's review quickly the plot. We do have an argument for this one, and so that's where we will begin. This argument, just like in Paradise Lost, is going to summarize the story. Let's just read this together now. Samson, made captive, blind, and now in the prison at Gaza, there to labor as in a common workhouse on a festival day, and the general cessation from labor, comes forth into the open air to a place nice, somewhat retired, there to sit a while and bemoan his condition. Can we just say it out loud? There's going to be a lot of bemoaning in this poem, so don't be shocked. Where he happens at length to be visited by certain friends and equals of his tribe, which make the chorus, who seek to comfort him what they can. The chorus is, of course, the ancient Greek idea. You have a group of people who are going to kind of speak for the audience, right? Then by his old father Manoah, who endeavors the like, and withal tells him his purpose to procure his liberty by ransom. We're going to think about Crito coming to Socrates and saying, I can get you out of this jail, an earlier lecture in the Harvard Classics list. Lastly, that this feast was proclaimed by the Philistines as a day of thanksgiving for the deliverance from the hands of Samson, which yet more troubles him. Manoah then departs to prosecute his endeavor with the Philistine lords for Samson's redemption, who in the meantime is visited by other persons, and lastly by a public officer to require his coming to the feast, where the lords and people to play or show his strength in their presence. He at first refuses, dismissing the public officer with absolute denial to come. At length, persuaded inwardly that this was from God, he yields to go along with him, who came now the second time with great threatenings to fetch him. The chorus yet remaining on the place, Manoah returns full of joyful hope to procure along his son's deliverance, in the midst of which discourses in Hebrew, comes in haste, confusedly at first, and afterwards more distinctly relating the catastrophe, what Samson had done to the Philistines, and by accident to himself, wherewith the tragedy ends. Now, to summarize this Samson Agonistes, you can really do it easily in 3 parts. Let's list it for our notes. Part 1, everything that happens before Delilah arrives. Part 2, Samson and Delilah in an exchange that is monumental. Part 3, after Delilah leaves, and of course the culminating Samson's revenge. I wish I could read all of this with you, as I've said in all these lectures, because reading Milton's stuff out loud is the way to do it, but I don't have time. But let's at least begin with the opening lines, another soliloquy. It's interesting how we seem to see more and more of these at the conclusion of Paradise Lost. We saw that famous soliloquy of Adam's after, of course, he has sinned. And then we had a number of these soliloquies, especially of Christ in Paradise Regained. And now we're going to have Samson's soliloquy. What is going on here? 2 things, I think. 1, Milton, as we've said, Milton always has Shakespeare standing behind him. to, I think Milton uses the soliloquy as a way to try to come to terms himself with some of the challenges. The blind Milton, the Milton who will soon die, has Samson speak this way. Opening lines. A little onward, lend thy guiding hand to these dark steps. A little further on. For yonder bank hath choice of sun or shade. Now, of course, Samson is blind. The language here could be Milton speaking as a little invocation to the muse. Help me to lead me on to a bank. Of course, if we're thinking about the end of paradise regained after Christ has overcome all the temptations, he's led to a sunny bank where he is then fed by the angels, right? There I am wont to sit when any chance relieves me from my task of servile toil. Thinking again of our comments about Shakespeare's Tempest and those final lines of Prospero. And here, notice a little bit of relief. We're going to hear more about that. Daily in the common prison else enjoined me, where I a prisoner and chained, we think about Prometheus bound, scarce freely drawn, the air imprisoned also, close and damp, unwholesome drought. But here I feel amends, the breath of heaven, fresh blowing, pure and sweet, with dayspring born, here leave me to respire. And it is to respire that, of course, Samson will hope that he can gain some relief. Of course, he's not going to get any relief. At line 30, the question will be, why? Why did this have to happen? Why was my breeding ordered and prescribed as of a person separate to God, designed for great exploits, if I must die, betrayed, captive, and both my eyes put out, made of my enemies the scorn, and gaze to grind in brazen fetters under task with this heaven-gifted strength? Why was I born with all this talent if I ended up not using all this talent? We've talked about the importance of the Matthew 25 story and the ways in which using your talents is a big, big deal to Milton. Oh, glorious strength, put to the labor of a beast debased, lower than bondslave. Promise was that I should Israel from Philistine yoke deliver. The word promise will be significant in this text. The idea of purpose, teleology, is always in the back of everything Milton's working with. And of course the idea of the yoke here, we think of the sonnet, on his blindness bear his mild yoke. Ask for this great deliverer now and find him. A famous line, eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves, himself in bonds under Philistine yoke. Of course, this is the question of theodicy, right? And I want to point out what I think is absolutely true. I was once asked to reduce all of Milton into one line, especially his theodicy. And the way I said it was, when bad things happen, no longer ask, why did this happen to me? But rather learn to ask, and underline the word learn as you write that down. Learn to ask, why did this happen for me? This will be central to our reading of Samson Agonistes. And if this poem does anything for us, okay, I think that it should do something to at least challenge us to ask the question, what do you do with all the pain and suffering in your life? And of course, by extension, in the lives of those around you as well. How can we explain all of that pain and suffering? That is the theodicic question, right? At line 43, yet stay, leave me not rashly, call in doubt divine prediction. Right? In other words, he says it, I want to make sure that that I don't have doubt, no skepticism. And then at line 46, he says, whom have I to complain of but myself? In other words, he says it, it's my own fault, right? We're going to hear this a lot, by the way. And then we'll keep reading through line 59. Who this gift, high gift of strength committed to me? In what part lodged, how easily bereft me under the seal of silence could not keep, but weakly to a woman must reveal it, overcome with importunity and tears. He's going to blame it already, and we're going to, this whole thing of misogyny, in the end, Samson is going to blame all of his problems on any number of different places. One, himself, two, the people around him who didn't follow him and help him, and then of course most importantly the women in his life, especially Delilah. But what is strength without a double share of wisdom? That's an interesting question, and of course we've often said that this distinction is drawn between our study of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Where we have Achilles, who's a certain kind of really strong, but not real bright type of person. And then Odysseus, who's more about the mind. What kind of strength is strength without wisdom? Vast, unwildly burdensome, proudly secure, yet liable to fall. We're, of course, thinking about Paradise Lost, Book 3, line 99, when we read that word fall. By weakest subtleties, not made to rule, but to subserve where wisdom bears command. God, when he gave me strength to show withal how slight the gift was, hung it in my hair. And, of course, the idea here is that this is the beginning of a long series of contemplations on, I screwed up. I seriously screwed up. And he gets to kind of live with the fact that he knows he screwed up. At line 67, he writes amazingly about loss of sight. And it takes us back to that sonnet, when I consider how my light is spent. The idea, of course, is that here, the worst thing about being blind is that he can't enjoy light. And, of course, that is to say God is light, and therefore he can't enjoy God. At line 102, he calls it a moving grave. Myself, my sepulcher, a moving grave. We think of Satan's comment, myself am hell, in Paradise Lost 475. Then at lines 115, the chorus enters. Now let's just say a comment or two about the chorus. This is a Greek invention, of course, and the idea of the chorus is it speaks for the audience. It can sometimes speak directly to the protagonist. Many would say that the chorus is the conduit whereby the audience comes to that catharsis or purgation, because the audience will speak the words that make the audience, the chorus will speak the words that make the audience kind of go, oh yeah, I guess that's absolutely right. And therefore they can begin to experience the fear and pity that's significant, right? The first thing that they point out is, oh, changed, unbelievably changed. Take a look at lines, at line 11:15. This is he, softly a while, let us not break in upon him. Oh, change beyond report, thought, or belief. See how he lies at random, carelessly diffused, past hope. Can this be he? Line 124. At line 156, the dungeon of thyself, the line 102 comment that we've already made from Paradise Lost, for myself am hell. These are all amazing lines, again, given that Milton is also blind himself. At line 167, but how much from the top of wondrous glory, strongest of mortal men, to lowest pitch of abject fortune, thou art fallen. This is directly Aristotelian poetics in play. And of course, we're thinking as well of Paradise Lost and the notion of fallenness and all of that, right? At line 176, we begin Samson's discourse or dialogue with the chorus. At line 198, he says, I feel like a foolish pilot because I screwed up and I wrecked my ship on the rocks. At line 201, he blames it on the deceitful woman. He says about himself, fool, to divulge the secret gift of God to a deceitful woman. And then he asks about himself being called a fool. At line 229, we have our first mention of the sorceress Delilah, that specious monster, my accomplished snare. And then, interestingly, at 241, Samson will blame the Israelite governors who didn't help him out. Notice how it's kind of like Adam passing, if you will, his blame on to Eve. At line 270, he says, Samson says about these Israelite politicians that they loved bondage with ease, to love bondage more than liberty, bondage with ease than strenuous liberty. We think a number of things as American readers. Of course, we think of Paine and his common sense, but we think about Milton's own political history here and the ways in which he was resentful all the end of his life about the fact that fewer Englishmen did not follow his lead during the Reformation. At 277, the chorus will talk about the failed reformers of Gideon and Jephthah, and at line 293, the chorus is now going to come to the theodicy of Milton. Just are the ways of God and justifiable to men unless there be who think not God at all. In other words, if you're an atheist, if any be, they walk obscure, for of such doctrine never was there school, but the heart of the fool hath said in his heart there is no God, and no man therein doctor but himself. We think of the opening lines of Goethe's Faust that come to mind. I've often pointed out with these lines that when you move from being the agnostic to the atheist, and you say, okay, this is what I don't believe, it's always an interesting question to follow up then by asking, well, what do you believe? I think Milton would want to challenge you with that question. You can list all the things you don't believe. Many readers of this poem today will say, most of this theology I just can't buy at all. Okay, so you know what you don't believe, but I think Milton would challenge you with this question, what do you believe, and how can you validate or prove that belief, right? The next lines for us that we'll turn to at line 326. But the chorus will say, but see, there's dark irony there, obviously. Samson can't see. Here comes thy reverend sire with careful step, locks white as down, old Manoah. And so now we'll have the father of Samson who arrives. And at line 340, the first thing he says is, oh, miserable change. At line 356, it's a tough question that is asked. Why grant me a prayer? At line 356, he says it. Why, oh, wherefore did God grant me my request, and as a blessing with such pomp adorned? In other words, why did he give me a son with all this amazing strength, and then the son can't do anything but get himself in trouble? Samson's response is powerful. He says at line 373 to 380, appoint not heavenly disposition, Father. Nothing of all these evils have befallen me, but justly. I get what I deserve. I myself have brought them on. Sole author I, sole cause. You'll remember that Satan himself said that he was the sole author of himself and all of that. But here notice that we have that notion of sole author. In other words, it's my fault. Go back and take a look at Paradise Lost, Book 10, line 958, and the ways in which Adam and Eve, in the end, blame themselves. Very similar. If aught seem vile as vile hath been my folly, who have profaned the mystery of God. In other words, he gave away the secret of his hair.